AMCU President Joseph Mathunjwa has blamed the Constitution for continuing inequality in the country.
He was speaking as the country is marking 11 years since 34 miners were shot dead by police during a wage strike at what was then the Lonmin Platinum Mine in Marikana. Mathunjwa says the victims and their families are yet to see justice.
This Constitution of South Africa must fall. What is the right to housing in Section 26 of the Constitution when you are staying emikukwini? What is the right to choose an occupation of your choice in Section 22 of the Constitution where there is no employment? What is the right to equality in Section 9 of the Constitution when Froneman earns 350 million rands in a year and you are earning 20 rand per hour in terms of the National Minimum Wage Act? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, with 20% super rich people and 60% super poor people.
Now, lawyers for survivors of the Marikana massacre say the victims have lost hope of ever getting an apology from those responsible. A
civil case against President Cyril Ramaphosa is continuing. He was a non-executive director at the then Lonmin Platinum Mine when the shooting happened.
I think as time goes by, our clients start to lose hope in the fact that those that they believe caused the massacre will apologize. And it's for that reason that they become steadfast in their belief that the courts is the only forums, the last forums of hope out of which they'll be able to get apologies given.
For more on the Marikana anniversary, we're joined tonight by University of Johannesburg sociology professor Kate Alexander. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thank you for your time. So, 11 years on, you're among one of the people, the groups, in fact, you went with researchers down to Marikana after the tragedy of 2012. And every year when we mark this anniversary, the themes are the same. The lack of justice for those who were killed or maimed, issues around development and extreme poverty, abject poverty in that community. What have you seen in terms of change? Has there been progress, or has the area, in fact, regressed?
I think there's been very little change as far as most people can see, except that frustration is increasing all of the time because of the lack of justice. And I think we have to hold the NPA primarily responsible for this because they have the records provided for them by IPID, which interviewed all of the people present at the killing fields where the massacre took place. So they will have even more detail about the killings than we got at the Farlam Commission. And yet, all of this time afterwards, the NPA has done nothing, absolutely nothing, to prosecute people. There have been no prosecutions whatsoever. And of course, this situation stands in stark contrast to what we had in the week of the massacre. It took only 4 days for the government to mobilize about 600 police. It's taken the government 11 years to do nothing in terms of the prosecution of the people who are responsible for those killings. So it's quite right that people should be angry with the NPA and angry with the government for their failure to ensure justice for not only the people of Marikana, but also for society in South Africa.
And 11 years on, you have to wonder if people who lost loved ones, who lost fathers in this tragedy, have any other option but to believe that the delay or the complete lack of movement in prosecutions is deliberate.
Quite so. I don't think people should give up, by the way. The facts are the facts, and they're well established. There's no controversy about what happened, the way in which the police killed 34 people, and this occurred in 2 different places at Marikana. In the second of those places, referred to as Scene 2, the evidence leaders speak about the way in which the police set out to annihilate those who were their enemies. It's a very strong term. In the first of those places, the one that was televised, it's very clear that the order to kill the workers was given by a senior police officer acting under instructions from the National Commissioner of Police. Now, these are the facts of the matter, and at some point there will have to be a new inquiry. There will have to be a situation where people are eventually brought to book. That might require a new government. It might require a situation where the president isn't somebody who is directly implicated in the events, but we can be sure that eventually there will be some degree of justice. So, of course, by then, many of the widows will themselves, unfortunately and very sadly, have died, so they won't be able to benefit fully from the compensation which they clearly deserve.
You suggested maybe the need for another inquiry further down the line. I wonder what shape you think that might have to take to be fully effective, and if, as you say, survivors and loved ones of those who were killed in Marikana during that strike, if they too are dying, part of the truth is likely to go with some of them.
Well, I mean, the evidence is very clear. We don't need extra evidence being brought by the police or by people. It's there in the archives. And I'm thinking back to the Belfast inquiry in Britain, where the first inquiry, and the Hillsborough inquiry in Britain as well, where the first inquiries were dilatory. They didn't provide justice. They allowed the police who were responsible to go free. But then there were subsequent inquiries held much more quickly, much more effectively, and people were found responsible for what had occurred. So I don't see any reason why a new inquiry should take nearly as long as the last one, which took far too long and didn't look at the evidence in the right order. The first job it should have done was to look at the objective evidence for who had been killed and where they were killed, and its second job would have been to interview all those people who were present, all the police who were present at Marikana at the day. There's no question whatsoever that the police were responsible for the killings. So the first job that you do is to interview the police. Now, they weren't interviewed until after the Commission of Inquiry was over. So very, very sadly, the Commission didn't do its job properly. So a new inquiry can deal with these things with the existing evidence that we have.
And over 170 million rand, I think the state had said, it had paid to families that decided to sue post the Marikana massacre. Is civil litigation perhaps the fastest way that these families can see some form of justice, or at the very least compensation? Is that what many of them may likely have to settle for?
Well, they've been pushing in different ways already to make sure that they are compensated. One of the things that surprises me is that we have a president who is one of the richest people in South Africa. At one point, he was reckoned by Forbes to be the 10th richest person in South Africa, a multi-billionaire, who is responsible for what's happened, who was a director at the time, and he could quite easily say, look, I don't want to accept responsibility for what happened, but I realize that this happened on my watch as the chief director of Lonmin. Let me help out. Let me pay out some of this money. The process is obviously taking far too long, but I've got the money. Now let me make sure that people who are suffering and who have suffered great losses should be given some funds as a form of compensation. But he won't do that. He won't acknowledge any responsibility whatsoever. And yet it was him who said that these were dastardly criminals, and it was that statement which justified the build-up of these massive police forces in Marikana, which led eventually to the killings. Now, he's not going to apologize in the way in which people want him to, because to do so would be to admit that he was in part responsible for the deaths that occurred. He was responsible in part for those deaths. He could have handled the matter completely differently. He could have done, as the Minister of Labour was arguing at the time, have ensured that there were negotiations which would avoid the terrible deaths that occurred.
The President will, when he responds, go back to the fact that the Parliament Commission of Inquiry, when it concluded its inquiry into what happened at Marikana, did not hold him responsible. But there was that commitment that he said to have made, even to the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela, that he would at some point go to Marikana. He's now been President for several years, yet we're yet to see that visit. How much longer can he hold off on that? And how important is it for him to, at the very least, go to Marikana in terms of just moving forward, even as a gesture, just for the community that was so affected?
Well, I think that's a question that you have to ask him rather than me. Only he knows the answer to that question, but I think it's a very reasonable question to be putting to him. But I think we should be clear about one other thing, and that is that the Parliament Commission didn't exonerate him of everything. They said that from the evidence that they could see, he wasn't responsible for murder. That didn't mean to say he wasn't responsible for some wrongdoing. And there is plenty of evidence to show that as a director, his company benefited, or would have benefited, from the defeat of the mine workers. And as the major shareholder, he in particular would have benefited financially from the defeat of the workers. So there is evidence, and it was presented, but rather likely to the Commission of Inquiry, that he was responsible for a form of corruption at Marikana. Now, I think this is something which has to be investigated further. It has to be tested in the courts. But this is just one of a number of things where we have to have the courts involved to assess whether or not various people were guilty of various offences. The person who should be top of the list, in my view, is Brigadier Kalitz, who was the operational commander at Marikana. He was the one who gave the instruction to engage. And immediately after that, the line of police officers shot the first workers. 17 of them died at that particular point. So there are plenty of people who should now be arrested. There's no reason whatsoever why they shouldn't be arrested. The evidence points very, very directly, and I would say conclusively, against them. And it's only then that we can begin to unravel the full truth of what happened.
And lastly, Professor, what about the 10 people who died in Marikana in the lead-up to the day of the massacre on August 16th, 2012? Because whenever the story is told, there are those who feel that the people who were harmed, killed or maimed by striking workers, intimidated, that they or their pain and their suffering is erased from the horror of what happened that year. How should we reckon with that part of the story?
No, I think it's important that we recognize the suffering of those people. Probably a few of them were killed by mine workers. They've never denied that. We don't know which mine workers were responsible, but this was a strike, a very bloody strike that was going on, and a strike which we must recognize involved the police killing workers even before the massacre itself. Police killed 3 workers. That has been subject to a court inquiry, and nobody's been found guilty for that either. So there's this multiplicity of injustice which has developed. It was very similar at the time, and had the police moved in more quickly, then I think it's far less likely that there would have been the deaths. For instance, the first killings, the first shootings, I should say, not killings, the first shootings were by members of the National Union of Mine Workers against some of their own members, against people who were on strike. Some were their members, some were members of the other union, AMCU, and at the time it was thought that these 2 people who were very badly wounded had in fact been killed, and it was this which led to the workers retreating to the kopje at Marikana, the mountain, from where they eventually moved off and were killed. Now, at the time, the police thought that those 2 people had been killed, and they didn't do anything to allay fears and to try to come to the people on the kopje and say, look, this is terrible what's happened. We're going to arrest those people who have been responsible for the killings of your comrades, or you might say now, with the benefit of hindsight, at least arrested them for badly injuring them in the course of that gunfire. So the period before the Marikana massacre was a period of bloodshed. It doesn't in any way exonerate the police, or for that matter, President Ramaphosa as he is now, for the deaths that occurred subsequently. There were terrible deaths of 10 people, but how does 10 deaths justify the killing of another 34? That doesn't make sense to me.
Professor Kate Alexandra, good to speak to you. Professor of Sociology with the University of Johannesburg.